Who would have thought that the birth of my first grandson would lead to the possible destruction of my 24-year marriage to Jane? I'm sitting in the back seat of a rented company van, a little further down the street from my daughter's house. I hope that what happens next won't put an end to what I considered a very loving and wonderful marriage. According to my daughter Sarah, Jane usually goes for a long run around noon on the days she visits her grandson. Sarah says Jane usually returns about an hour later looking quite flushed after her workout. I'm here to see what Jane's workout entails. My name is Bill Jones, and just a month ago, I was living the dream. My business is thriving, I'm 47 years old, and I'm a co-owner of a manufacturing plant on the brink of receiving a new patent that will revolutionize one of the plastic extrusion processes. If all goes according to plan, I'll make several million from the patent even after sharing the profits with my co-inventor and 5 investors who supported our development. Besides my work, I thought my personal life was everything I could dream of. Like I said, my wife seemed to love me and our life together. We have one child, Sarah, whom we both proudly call our daughter. Sarah met, married, and got pregnant by a wonderful man 10 years her senior right after college. The most amusing thing about Sarah is how effortlessly she became a full-time mother and homemaker. Here's a girl, actually a woman, but she'll always be my girl, who graduated with honors and was determined to take the financial world by storm. Her graduation gift from her mom and me was a 6-week tour of Europe. It was her reward for finishing college in 3 years, saving us a lot of money, picking herself up while most of her peers spent their spring and summer breaks at the beach. Sarah met her future husband in Europe. She claims it was love at first sight, something she hadn't deemed possible before that first evening in Madrid. She also insists it was fate. Jim Taylor hailed from Jane's hometown of Olympia. When Sarah returned from her European tour, she moved into her grandparents' house, Jane's parents, and 6 months later, she was engaged to Jim. 18 months later, she married him and became pregnant with our first grandchild. Jane couldn't have been more thrilled. She immediately cut back her hours at work to spend time with Sarah and the baby. So now you know that my work life is great, and I'm a very happy dad-granddad-father-in-law. That brings us to my marriage with Jane. Jane and I met at Washington University. I was a senior, and Jane transferred here from Washington State. We had classes together, one of those required for a college degree. Jane has been and remains a very attractive woman. She's 170 centimeters tall, has an athletic build, and has been running since high school. She has a stunning smile and beautiful brown eyes. I was smitten the first day I saw her, but our few conversations after class made me step back as she seemed reserved. By the end of the quarter, I gathered enough courage, and she accepted my invitation to go somewhere. One date led to another, and everything was falling into place for a long-term romance. I learned the reason for her hesitation after our 3rd or 4th date. She had recently gone through a very tough breakup. Jane caught her boyfriend of 2 years in high school and 2 years in college in bed with another girl. Jane endured his infidelity for almost 3 months before finally giving him an ultimatum. He had to choose. By that time, he was quite cocky and blatantly chose both, suggesting a threesome. Jane had had enough. Shortly after that, she dropped out of school and transferred to the university. I think this led to our second chance at romance. The topic seemed to touch Jane deeply, and she never brought it up again. I'm quite sure that Jane and I had a pretty good marriage and that she was a faithful, loving wife for the next 23 years. Although there were occasional minor disagreements, we never went to bed without resolving these issues and, at the very least, kissing each other goodnight. I never strayed from the path. Of course, I sometimes admired other women, but I never felt tempted to ruin something good by crossing that line. Jane would occasionally catch me ogling a woman at the beach or on the dance floor. She would lightly pat me on the shoulder and say, "Remember, you can look, but not for too long, and never touch." She always said it with a smile and a sparkle in her eyes. So, what happened? When Sarah's son William was born, yes, named after me, Jane decided she needed to spend time with Sarah and little Bill, as we call him. Once a week, Jane would get into her car and drive 100 kilometers from our home in North Seattle to Olympia. Mileage-wise, it's not far, but anyone who's driven that stretch knows that the journey from point A to point B takes hours. After a couple of months of back and forth trips on the same day, and as winter approached, Sarah bought a sleeper sofa and placed it in their office so Jane could stay overnight. Jane could head south in the morning on the first day and be back home before rush hour on the second. I used the evenings when Jane wasn't home to work on the patent. This new routine worked so well that Jane continued to stay overnight in Olympia even after the weather improved the following spring. On Saturday, June 27th, little Bill had his first birthday. Sarah and Jim planned to throw a party in the bar in their large backyard to celebrate the occasion. During the picnic, two minor incidents occurred, and both played their part in piecing together the fragments of this mystery. I sat in a comfortable lounge chair, sipping cold beer, when Jim and Sarah joined me. They noticed me staring at Jane. Jim spoke first. "You're a lucky man, Dad. I must admit, I followed my father's advice and looked at Sarah's mother to see what my future wife would look like at 40 before proposing." Sarah patted him on the shoulder, just as her mom always did to me. "You're a pig. I can't believe you'd say that. What if my mom wasn't such a babe? Would you have dumped me?" I tried to save Jim. "It's true, Sarah. I did the same. Just one look at your grandma convinced me your mom was an angel." With those words, Sarah hit me on the shoulder. "All right, Dad, but what are us girls supposed to do? Look at our dads?" In that case, I prefer admiring the shiny bald spot. The three of us glanced over at Jim's father working in the bar and laughed. Jim's dad is a great guy and handsome, but he's dealing with male pattern baldness, trying to grow out and comb over his hair. Right now, the wind was blowing it, and he looked like a future president. "Well, anyway, you're right, Jim. I'm a lucky guy. How many men are married to a 45-year-old woman with the body of a 30-year-old? Sarah replied, "She must be in great shape, considering how much she runs. Every day she's here. Mom heads out at noon and spends at least an hour running to the waterfront and back. I don't know how she does it." "Yeah, she runs at home at least 4 days a week. Once or twice a week, I join her outside, and she pushes me hard. She runs 6 kilometers at a 7-minute pace. I think this fall she's going to try a half marathon. You have to give her credit." Around this time, Jeff, Jim's father, gathered everyone and started serving corn on the cob grilled in its husk and burgers, including some amazingly tasty veggie burgers. The first ones I've ever had. I sat with Jeff and Jim. We compared work notes. Jeff had a restaurant supply business, and he was grooming Jim to take it over when it's time for him to retire in 10 years or so. After eating, I went inside to get a couple of beers for the three of us, and just as I was about to step out through the door into the backyard, something caught my attention inside the house behind Jim and Sarah. I took a step back into the house and focused my gaze. Sure enough, Jim and Sarah's neighbor from the backyard was standing by the window on the upper floor, peering into our yard through binoculars. I couldn't say for certain, but it seemed like he was watching the table where Jane, Sarah, and Jim's mom were sitting. Creepy. When I returned through the door to the backyard, the neighbor quickly lowered his binoculars and stepped away from the window. "Jim, what's up with your neighbor behind you? I just saw him looking this way through binoculars." Both Jim and Jeff grabbed their beers and looked at me as if to ask, "What the hell?" "That's Alan Ross. He's actually a sales rep for one of our main suppliers, and this guy gives me the creeps. Last year, we had a neighborhood watch party, and even though he doesn't live in our neighborhood, he showed up. It struck everyone as a bit odd. I've caught him staring at Sarah more than once, so I approached him and talked to him. He obviously recognized me, was surprised we were neighbors, and apologized. He said Sarah reminded him of someone he knew from high school. I let it go, but it was weird. Well, I hope you keep the curtains in your back bedroom closed." What an idiot. But something about this rang a bell in my head. The day had been long, and by the time Jane and I headed home, I had forgotten about the neighbor. I only remembered on Sunday morning. Jane was out for one of her runs, and I was on my second cup of coffee, so I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out one of Jane's high school yearbooks. We keep all these nostalgic things along with photo albums in the study. I searched for the name Alan Ross, and to my great surprise, there was a handwritten note in the margins. "Jane, these have been 2 wonderful years with you, and as your favorite song goes, we're just getting started. I look forward to the next year at WSU and all the years to come. Your eternal love, AL.SO." It was Jane's ex-boyfriend who lived right behind Sarah and Jim. Did she know? If she did, why didn't she say anything? These and dozens of other questions were swirling in my head until Jane came home and took a shower. By the time she came downstairs, I had a fruit and yogurt smoothie ready. As usual, Jane looked so fresh, blushing, and radiant. She looked so beautiful that I almost chickened out, but I held my breath and asked the million-dollar question. Jane, do you know someone named Alan Ross? Jane's response was so smooth. Looking back, it seems like she almost anticipated this question and was ready for the answer. I knew Alan Ross in high school. We even dated for a while. Why do you ask? Jane's answer caught me off guard, and I decided to play out the rest of the hand openly. He lives behind Sarah and Jim. When Jim noticed Ross looking at Sarah, he called him out, and Ross said she reminded him of a girl he knew in high school. Considering how much Sarah resembles you at that age, I thought maybe you were the girl he was talking about. It's possible, but why bring it up? Did something happen? Actually, no, but I thought I saw him watching us yesterday from his house. It just seemed a bit strange, that's all. Then events cascaded to this moment when I sat in this rented van. Firstly, the next time I went into the study, Jane's high school yearbook for the graduating class wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was like a punch to the gut. I had to sit in my leather chair and catch my breath. What the hell is going on? That's when Sarah's comment from yesterday's lunch popped into my head. Mom goes out for a run every day for an hour. The implications were too dreadful to contemplate. My Jane with another man? Should I confront Jane? Should I talk to Sarah? Or maybe hire a private detective? I remember reading something where someone asked, "You should ask yourself, would you be better off without her?" I didn't think I could bear Jane cheating on me, but would I divorce her? I couldn't answer that question that evening, especially with the scarce information I had. I went upstairs, took a sleeping pill, and went to bed. I don't even remember if I kissed Jane goodnight, but I must have, because she didn't mention it at breakfast on Monday. The next 2 days at work were too hectic to think about my personal problems. Our investors were in town on Monday and Tuesday to finalize our patent progress schedule. It would have been impossible to answer their questions and at the same time try to devise a plan related to my marriage. I would have enough time once the investors left on Tuesday afternoon. I accepted that and got to work. Closer to Tuesday evening, I dropped off the investors in Cetus. On my way home, I called Jane on her mobile. She was spending Tuesday and Wednesday at Sarah's. When Jane didn't answer my calls, I called Sarah.
Sara,
I've been trying to reach your mom, but she's not picking up. Is she there?
No, Dad.
Mom went to Cindy Sullivan's tonight. I think she's Mom's former classmate. Interesting, she never mentioned her before. Is a party at Cindy's a regular thing? Not really. It's irregular. Maybe once every few weeks she goes and meets someone she knew when she lived here. Usually, she's back home by 10, unless she has too much wine and stays overnight. Mom says it's always nice to get together with the women she grew up with. She says she still feels closer to the girls from our small town than to the women in Seattle. Living here in Olympia for the last 3 years, I can understand her point of view. Yeah, it's a shame that your mom never really liked Nordstrom fans. She always felt more comfortable in jeans and boots. Maybe when I retire, we can make that happen. Do it sooner, Dad. Jim and I are planning on having more kids, and it would be great if all 4 of their grandparents lived nearby. Sarah, you never cease to amaze me. I never imagined my little go-getter would be talking about having a bunch of kids. Just found the man of my dreams and discovered that I enjoy being a mom. You and Mom can take a big part of the blame for that. All right, Sarah, I'm hitting the road now. It's a good night tonight, and I think I'll jump on the Harley and take a long ride this evening. Let your mom know I won't be answering calls because I'll be on the motorcycle. Good night. Good night, Dad. Ride safely. It was a good night for a ride, and I had a destination in mind for tonight's evening trip. By the time I arrived at Alan Ross's house, it was already dark. There was just enough light to slowly pass by his house and see the red Mustang Boss 429 in the driveway in front of the 2-car garage and no signs of Jane's Volvo. I was almost ready to accelerate when something made me stop. The license plate was one of those expensive state-issued ones. The plate had a WSU Cougar emblem, and the license number was Ross Boss. Why would a guy park his expensive sports car in the driveway instead of the garage? I rode down the street for about a block and a half to the school. In front of it was one of those roundabouts for school buses. I parked the motorcycle and pretended to be working on the Harley, just in case. I took off the seat. I kept an eye on Ross's house, pretending to be distracted. Unfortunately, that didn't work either. Olympia is still a small enough town for a guy on a motorcycle to attract attention. About half an hour later, a police car pulled up nearby. Need anything? Not really, but thanks for asking, officer. I thought I might have a short circuit in the electrical system, but it turns out the last mechanic didn't tighten the negative wire on the battery. I'm just finishing up and will be leaving in about 10 minutes. I tried to look the officer in the eyes as we chatted. What will you do if that doesn't fix it? My daughter and her husband live on 3rd. I'll just ride over there, but I think I've got it sorted out. Thanks again. The police officer left, but I saw him driving a few streets further as I put on my helmet. The motorcycle was running and the headlights were on, so he left me alone. It was already very dark and Ross's Mustang wasn't moving. The next step promised to be difficult and perhaps more than awkward if I made a mistake and got caught. I headed towards Ross's house at a decent speed, enough to kill the engine and pull up to the front of his house. I parked the motorcycle, dashed up the driveway, and had to tiptoe to peer inside the garage through the windows at the top of the garage door. On the right was a Mercedes S-Class convertible, and on the left was my wife's Volvo. I don't know how I did it. Maybe the past 3 days made me believe I would find exactly what I found, and it wasn't such a big surprise. But I had enough nerve to go back to the Harley, start it up, and bowled off like a bat out of hell. I rode for 20 minutes, pulled into a tavern near the military base, and pulled out my cell phone. This time Jane answered.
Bill.
Sarah said you were out riding today. Are you home? Almost. How about you? What's on your mind? I'm at Cindy Sullivan's. She's an old friend from elementary and high school. I think I'll end up spending the night here. I had a couple of glasses of wine and seems like I went overboard. I feel okay, just don't want to take any risks. That's a good idea. Listen, I needed to talk to you tonight because the meeting with investors ran into a couple of issues. I'm flying out tomorrow and won't be back until everything is sorted out. Sorry for dropping this on you last minute. Oh, Bill, I'll miss you. If you won't be in town, is it okay if I stay here in Olympia until you return? You know how much I hate being home alone. No, go ahead and stay with Sarah. I'll let you know before I fly back home. It should be no later than Saturday. Take care. Goodbye, Bill. I love you. Damn, why did she have to go and say that? It just made her betrayal worse. Of course, I wasn't actually planning on leaving town. I just didn't want to deal with Jane while I sorted out the rest of my life. I drove home, trying to see through blurred eyes. I don't think I'm weak, but I'm not ashamed to admit that a few tears fell and a string of curses escaped my lips as I thought about 25 years spent with a woman I loved more than myself, the mother of my daughter, and the grandmother of our beautiful grandson. I wondered if my life would ever be happy again. On Wednesday, I called my business partner, explained the situation, and told him I wouldn't be around for a few days. He was understanding and offered the usual condolences, but deep down, he was probably thinking about how it would affect our deal. I can't blame him if that's what was on his mind. We were so close to building a small fortune together, and here I am dumping it all on him. Next, a call to our lawyer for a recommendation on a divorce attorney, making sure he knows it has to be a very good lawyer, maybe the best. I wouldn't want to split millions with a cheating whore who might end up with a jerk spending my money on cars and whatnot. The lawyer I was referred to understood the urgency of the situation and agreed to meet with me that same evening in his office. He was upfront about it. I could count on paying him a substantial fee for the meeting outside of business hours to clear his schedule and expedite the document processing, but he assured me it would be worth my money. I checked into a local hotel, just in case she was talking to the neighbor, and called Jane at noon. Of course, she didn't answer. Whether she was running away or jumping on Ross's bones at that moment didn't matter. I just wanted to avoid any conversation. I left her a message saying I'd be busy with meetings, but would call her in the evening. When I met with the lawyer that evening, he took charge of everything. Obviously, he had dealt with similar situations before. He listened to my tale of woe and my desire to move forward without risking my scalp. He said the documents would be ready by Friday morning and gave me a checklist for how to break up, bills to close, items to mark, how I wanted to notify Jane, etc. When he heard about my plan to serve divorce papers to Jane, he started shaking his head. I assured him I could do it without ending up in jail. He said he still didn't advise it, but he could understand my motivation. Just don't be stupid. On Thursday, I went through the checklist. One credit card remained open, Jane's, but the credit line had been reduced from $30,000 to $10,000. We were paying off the balance each month, so there wasn't much risk of alerting Jane before the payment day arrived. On Friday at 8 a.m., I sat in the lawyer's reception area. He nearly smiled as he walked in the door. He went straight to his desk and handed me an envelope with my name on it. I signed where I needed to, and as I was leaving, he reminded me, "Remember, I said don't be a fool." Heading south to Olympia, I stopped by a car rental office in Citas and left in a white service van. Now I'm sitting a block away from Alan Ross's house, on the far side from the school. I didn't want to be mistaken for a creep, waiting for the day when my marriage would finally crumble for good. At 11:45, Jane emerges from around the corner dressed in athletic wear. She heads towards Ross's house, climbs the steps, slips her hand under the planter, and enters the door as if it were her own home. At 11:55, Alan Ross pulls up in his Mercedes and parks in the garage. At 11:56, I pull up in the van to Sarah's house. Sarah is surprised to see me, but not as much as when I tell her why I'm here. I tried to explain it to her in a way that wouldn't shock her, but that's probably unrealistic. I asked her to call her husband Jim and meet us at home as soon as he can leave. I knew that when it all ends, Sarah would need Jim's strength.
No, Dad, no.
This just can't be true. Mom loves you. She would never cheat on you, and I can't be that naive. If she were cheating, I would know. You must have misunderstood everything. Sarah, I would give anything for this not to be true. I've loved your mother for over 25 years. Damn it, we were planning to celebrate our 25th anniversary next year. But let me tell you what I saw. I told Sarah all the evidence I had at that moment. Sarah still refused to believe. We took Little Bill out of his crib, drove Sarah's car with Little Bill in his car seat around the corner, and parked in front of Alan Ross's house. Sarah stayed in the car, and I walked up to the front door with an envelope made of thick paper. I had to call and knock before that jerk in a robe opened the door. "Who the hell are you?" said the pleasant guy. "I'm Jane's husband. Would you please call her to come to the door? I want to talk to her." He stood there with his mouth open. He tried to slam the door, but I was ready for it and wedged my foot in the frame. It hurt like hell, but I kept the door open. I pushed it open with my shoulder and shouted inside, "Jane, come here right now." Ross kept pushing against the door, but it didn't help him because now my torso was in the way. I kept shouting for Jane to come to the door. I don't know how, but I kept my cool and didn't threaten Ross or Jane, but I kept shouting for her to come to the door. When Jane finally appeared, she was in her workout clothes again. I suppose she was naked when Ross opened the door. She had the frightened look in her eyes that I loved. "Bill, what's going on? Why are you here?" "This isn't the real question, Jane. The real question is, why are you here?" I took the opportunity to grab Ross by the robe's collar and open it wide. Underneath, he was, of course, naked. That moment, Jane was looking past me. The three of us were still standing at the doorway. I turned around and saw what Jane was staring at. Sarah had gotten out of her car and was witnessing the whole episode. "Did you really have to bring our daughter here?" That bitch was angry at me. No, she wanted to come because she said her mother couldn't have possibly cheated on our marriage. She was eager to prove that all of this was just my imagination. And you can be angry at me all you want, but I didn't cook up this mess, you did. I was starting to lose my temper, so I needed to back off immediately. I handed Jane a thick paper envelope. She touched it as if I had handed her a live grenade, only in my dreams. "I'll stay with Jim and Sarah for the night. You can stay with your long-lost guy. Read the documents, hire a lawyer, and don't come back home until you understand what's in those papers and can comply with the terms." I'll ask Jim to bring your suitcase and personal belongings from their house. I don't know what Sarah and Jim are going to do next. It's their decision. But you and I are getting divorced. Goodbye, Jane." I turned and walked away. It seemed like I heard Jane cry out, but Ross slammed the door too loudly to be sure. "Father, I'm so sorry. You should take us back home. I don't think I can handle this." Sarah practically collapsed into my arms as I opened the passenger door for her. Although my life was terrible from that moment on and in the following months, I don't think it compares to how much worse it was for Jane. Jim was shocked when he heard about Jane and Alan Ross. He was so angry that for several months, he refused to let Jane into their home or allow her to see her grandchild. Sarah didn't argue with Jim. If Jim was angry, Sarah was furious. I was at their house when Jane called Sarah to talk. Sarah essentially called her own mother everything but a crap and told Jane that she might never forgive her for breaking her father's heart. Ross lost Taylor's account and, thanks to a call from Jeff Taylor to Ross's boss, ultimately lost his job. Ross blamed Jane for his misfortune and ended up kicking her out of his house. Jane moved in with her parents. Later, Sarah told me that Jane's parents were unhappy with the situation, but understood that Jane didn't have many alternatives until the divorce and financial settlement were finalized. The divorce was finalized within 6 months. My legal team made sure that Jane didn't get anything from the patent sale. They managed to protect almost all the money because the patent was sold to a foreign company, and my share was placed in an offshore trust. Don't ask me how. All I know is that it cost me a 6-figure sum to make it all work, but it kept the money from falling into Jane's hands. She did get a lot, though. Half of the sale of our house, half of our savings, but far from millions. Soon after the divorce, I did receive a letter from Jane, but it didn't explain why she cheated. Perhaps her justifications made sense to her, but not to me. It contained the usual excuses: an empty nest, loneliness, the need for closeness with Ross, even after so many years. What the letter didn't explain was why she jeopardized what I considered a great marriage, only for such crappy reasons. Jane didn't handle her new reality well. The divorce, parting with Sarah and Bill Jr., and finally, breaking up with Ross again. Her behavior became erratic. She started drinking and continued to spiral downhill. Eventually, Jane went to rehab at her parents' insistence. I suppose most jilted husbands would take some satisfaction in seeing their ex-wife who cheated getting what she deserved, and there are moments when a slight smile creeps onto my lips at the thought of her suffering. But let's face the truth. I loved this woman for so many years. I tried to shield her from pain for so long. How could I just stop caring about her? I thank God for the support I received from my children. Maybe I felt uneasy because I destroyed my ex-wife, but I had no guilt about what I did to Ross. I laughed at a couple of Jim's actions even after his father fired Ross. One evening, Jim peeked over the fence and saw Ross having fun with a young woman. Jim walked over to the fence, beckoned the woman over, and started asking her what it was like to be with a guy who slept with a married woman and then dumped her when she needed him. Jim chuckled as the woman walked out through the side gate. He watched as Ross came out of his back door with 2 glasses of wine in his hands, scanning the yard for his companion. Jim did the same thing a few weeks later when Ross was entertaining a group of friends in his backyard. Jim stood by the fence and asked the group what they thought of their scumbag friend. But the final straw for Ross came a month later when I was helping the kids move into their new home. Sarah had to leave Ross, and they needed a bigger place since Sarah was pregnant again. Ross was in the backyard mowing his lawn. I told Jim to wait a couple of minutes, then start recording the scene on his smartphone, but to make sure to cover the microphone with his thumb. I hopped over the fence and started talking quietly to Ross. I said a few things to rile him up. Ross was so angry that he took the bait. Jim captured it on video. I stood there with my hands down by my sides when Ross threw the first punch. I was ready for it and bent down enough to only catch a jab. My first punch from a turn hit Ross right in the nose. The sound of crunching in his nose and the sight of blood made my heart beat faster. The second punch landed square on Ross's solar plexus. Ross doubled over and he began to retch. I had to step back quickly to avoid getting my shoes dirty with his bile. As he bent over, heaving, I grabbed him by the ear, twisted him toward hell and whispered, "You won't be so lucky next time. Next time, You'll get seriously hurt. Ross was still bent over when I walked out of his yard through the front gate. Somehow, his Mercedes started up. Childish, I know, but it just seemed right at the time. That I immediately went to the police station with Jim. My story was that Ross invited me to his yard. I thought it was to apologize, but when I got there, Ross swung at me, and I was just defending myself. Jim showed the cops his recording, and under oath, I filed a complaint for assault. A few hours later, Ross came out of the emergency room and headed to the police station to file a complaint against me under oath. The whole episode boiled down to a he said, she said, and in the end, I walked out of the courthouse scot-free. It's funny, not haha funny. I've believed in the philosophy of win-win throughout my entire career. I always look for a way for both sides of a contract to leave the room in good spirits. There's nothing guaranteed in divorce, at least nothing I could point to. It's definitely a losing scenario, no matter how strongly you accuse your former cheating spouse. It's been 2 years since that awful day I sat in a rental van. I wish I could say I'd met a 30-year-old bikini model who loved sex and swore me eternal love and fidelity, but we all know life isn't like that. I had 24 wonderful years with a woman I loved with all my heart. I have 2 wonderful children. Yes, I consider Jim my son, and now 2 grandchildren. Financially, I'm in great shape. You know how many men get taken advantage of by the system and end up living in a 1-bedroom apartment, supporting their cheating ex-wife? Too many, but at least that's not my fate. No, I have enough money to live comfortably and even travel. Currently, I'm spending a month touring Italy. I even participated in the MotoGP races at Mugello. But when I sit and drink espresso outside a cafe in Florence, I have to hold back tears. Jane and I always talked about doing this together. Going on a motorcycle tour of Italy with no deadlines and just each other. Now I'm doing it without her. Jane has been released from the rehabilitation center but still lives with her parents. Sarah and Jim allow her to visit the grandchildren for no more than an hour each month. I think Sarah does this as a form of torture. She still hasn't forgiven her mother. I'm haunted by the question, how could she do this to us? Life isn't a movie where answers are given before the credits. It's more like a Joseph Conrad novel. Life just is, often absurd, and good guys don't always win. I finish my espresso, put my helmet back on, start the motorcycle, and head into my own heart of darkness.
Thank you for being with us and listening until the end. If you found it interesting, please subscribe, give us a like, and leave your comments.